The Marlowe estate was not merely a restaurant, it was a cathedral dedicated to the worship of wealth. Sunlight, meticulously filtered through crystalline windows, bathed the room in a soft, golden glow, glinting off polished silver and the facets of diamond earrings. The air itself seemed different here, thick with the scent of white orchids and the quiet, confident hum of conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and the lamentable state of the stock market. Every detail, from the starched linen napkins to the hushed footsteps of the staff, was orchestrated to create an atmosphere of effortless perfection. For Jasmine Olivia, this perfection was anything but effortless. At 22, she moved through this opulent theatre like a ghost, her presence essential, but intentionally unnoticed. Her uniform, a crisp black dress with a simple white apron, was designed to blend into the shadows. She was a master of the silent refill, the discreet removal of a finished plate, the intuitive understanding of when to approach a table and when to vanish. The guests saw through her, their eyes passing over her, as if she were part of the decor, a functional object in their world of extravagant consumption. They spoke freely in her presence, their voices weaving a tapestry of high-stakes deals and casual cruelties, never once imagining that the quiet young woman pouring their Evian could understand the nuances of the French wine order, the whispered Spanish complaint about a rival, or the complex, guttural cadence of Russian. "Olivia, Table 7 needs their check. Now." The voice was a shard of ice in the warm ambiance. Martin Crowley, the restaurant's general manager, materialized beside her, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile a rictus of strained hospitality. To the guests, he was the epitome of charm and efficiency. To his staff, he was a petty tyrant who ruled his domain with a mixture of condescension and fear. "Right away, Mr. Crowley," Jasmine murmured, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She had learned long ago that direct eye contact was interpreted as a challenge. "And when you're done with that," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, "make sure the Volkov table is pristine. Not a speck of dust, not a single water spot on the crystal. He's arriving at 1 o'clock, and this lunch could determine the future of this establishment." His eyes scanned her from head to toe, a familiar, dismissive appraisal that always made her feel like a flawed piece of inventory. "Try to look presentable, and for God's sake, stay out of the way unless you're summoned. We don't need our most important client distracted by the help." The word help landed with its usual sting, a small, sharp prick to her dignity. But Jasmine just nodded, her face a mask of placid obedience. "Yes, Mr. Crowley." As he glided away to charm a wealthy dowager at table 3, Jasmine felt the familiar burn of resentment rise in her throat, a taste as bitter as burnt coffee. The irony was a constant, silent companion in her life. Martin Crowley, whose proudest achievement was a hospitality management certificate from a community college, had no idea that the help he so casually dismissed was, until 18 months ago, a scholarship student at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, on track for a career in international diplomacy. She moved toward the kitchen, the memory surfacing unbidden, as it often did during these moments of quiet humiliation. She saw herself in a lecture hall, debating the nuances of post-Soviet economic policy with a professor who had once advised presidents. She remembered the thrill of mastering the complex grammar of the Russian language, not just from textbooks, but from the stories her grandmother, a refugee from Leningrad, had told her as a child. Her grandmother had filled their small apartment with the sounds and smells of a world left behind, teaching Jasmine the Cyrillic alphabet before she learned cursive, singing her lullabies about the birch trees and the wide, endless steppe. It was a legacy of resilience and intellect that Jasmine carried like a secret treasure. Then came the phone call that shattered her world. A rain-slicked highway, a drunk driver, and in an instant, she was an orphan. Her life, once a clearly defined path toward embassies and state departments, fractured into a desperate scramble for survival. She became the sole guardian of her younger sister, Lily, whose cystic fibrosis required a relentless regimen of expensive medications and treatments. The Georgetown scholarship was a dream she could no longer afford. The only thing that mattered was a steady paycheck, and the Marlowe estate offered the best tips in the city. So, she had traded her textbooks for a tray, her diplomatic ambitions for a starched apron. She learned to swallow her pride, along with the condescending remarks, to make herself small and invisible, to channel all her intelligence into anticipating the needs of people who would never know her name. "Hey, Jas." The voice belonged to Carlos, the head busboy, his kind eyes a small island of warmth in the restaurant's cold hierarchy. He was a middle-aged man from El Salvador who worked 2 jobs to send money home to his family, and he was one of the few people who saw her as more than just a uniform. "Crowley on your case again?" Jasmine forced a small smile. "The usual. Big client coming in. The sky is falling." Carlos shook his head, stacking plates with practiced efficiency. "That man. He thinks because he wears a fancy suit, he is a king. He forgets we are the ones who make his kingdom run." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "Be careful today. I heard the owners were here this morning. The pressure is high. This Volkov is not just any rich man. They say he is different." Jasmine nodded, her curiosity piqued. She knew the name Nikolai Volkov. He was a titan of the tech and biomedical industries, a reclusive figure who rarely appeared in the press. Her grandmother had spoken of his family, the Volkovs, with a strange mixture of awe and fear. Old Russian aristocracy who had somehow survived the revolution and re-emerged in the new era of capitalism with their immense wealth intact. He was a man steeped in history, a puzzle she would have loved to analyze back in her Georgetown days. Now, her only concern was whether he preferred his water with or without lemon. As 1 o'clock approached, a palpable tension settled over the Marlowe estate. The usual lunchtime buzz quieted. Staff moved with an almost frantic precision. Crowley was a whirlwind of nervous energy, straightening already perfect flower arrangements and barking orders into his headset. At precisely 1:05 p.m., the world outside the restaurant's heavy oak doors seemed to hold its breath. A sleek, black Maybach, followed by 2 black Escalades, pulled up to the curb. Men in dark suits, their faces impassive, emerged from the Escalades and secured the perimeter with an efficiency that spoke of military training. Then, the rear door of the Maybach opened. Nikolai Volkov was not a man who commanded attention with size or volume. He was of average height, lean, and in his early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. But as he stepped into the restaurant, the entire room seemed to tilt on its axis, reorienting itself around him. He possessed an aura of immense, coiled power, the quiet confidence of a man who had bent the world to his will and found it wanting. He moved with a predator's grace, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in every detail, missing nothing. Crowley practically scurried to greet him, his professional smile stretched to its limit. "Mr. Volkov, an absolute honor to welcome you to the Marlowe estate. We have your favorite table ready for you in the private dining room." Volkov gave a curt nod, but his attention was elsewhere. He began speaking in rapid, decisive Russian to his aide, a younger man with a harried expression. Jasmine, standing by a service station, instinctively understood every word. "The security is acceptable, but the ambiance is loud," Volkov said, his voice a low baritone. "Tell him the private room had better be soundproof. This is not a social lunch. The final details of the Foundation's charter must be settled today. There can be no distractions." The aide turned to Crowley. "Mr. Volkov is pleased with the arrangements, but requires absolute privacy for his meeting." Of course. The St. Regis room is completely isolated. We've even brought in a professional translator, Ms. Dubois, to facilitate your discussions with the legal team. She's the best in the city," Crowley gushed, leading the party toward the back of the restaurant. Jasmine watched them go, a strange ache in her chest. She heard Volkov mention the Foundation's charter. She had read about it in a stray article online. The Elena Volkov Foundation for Genetic Research, named after his late wife, who had died from a rare, incurable disease. He was about to sign a deal that would pour $500 million into creating a world-class research institute. It was the kind of work she had once dreamed of supporting through diplomatic channels. Now, she was just the person who would be serving them coffee. She busied herself, her mind a million miles away, when Crowley's frantic voice cut through the air again. He was on the phone near the host stand, his back to the main dining room, but his panicked stage whisper was carrying. "What do you mean she's not coming? A burst appendix? Are you serious? No, that's not acceptable. Find me someone else. Anyone. This is Nikolai Volkov. The deal is worth hundreds of millions." A cold knot formed in Jasmine's stomach. She saw the aide emerge from the private room, his expression impatient. He approached Crowley, who was now pale, sweat beading on his upper lip. "Is there a problem, Mr. Crowley? The legal team is here. Mr. Volkov is ready to begin." No problem at all," Crowley stammered, forcing a ghastly smile. "Just a slight delay. The translator. She's been held up in traffic. A minor issue." But Jasmine knew it wasn't a minor issue. She could hear the aide speaking into his sleeve in Russian. "The translator is not here. The manager is lying. This is typical American incompetence." Inside the private room, she could just make out Volkov's sharp, irritated reply. If they cannot handle a simple logistical task, how can we trust them with the complexities of this partnership? Tell them they have 10 minutes. After that, we are leaving. We will finalize this with the team in Zurich. The aide relayed a sanitized version of the message. "Mr. Volkov is on a very tight schedule. He hopes the traffic issue can be resolved in the next few minutes." The threat was clear. The deal, the foundation, the future of the restaurant. It was all hanging by a thread. Crowley was now frantically scrolling through his phone, his hand shaking. Jasmine saw him dial a number, then another, his face growing more desperate with each call. "No one is available. On this short notice, what am I supposed to do?" he hissed into his phone. Jasmine's heart began to pound. She could solve this. The knowledge was a living thing inside her, a current of electricity. She could walk over there, explain the situation, and bridge the gap. But then she saw Crowley's face, contorted with rage and panic. She remembered his daily humiliations, his casual cruelty. He would never accept help from her. He would see it as an insult, an act of insubordination. He would fire her on the spot for even daring to approach the table. She stood frozen, trapped between the desire to help and the paralyzing fear of the consequences. She thought of Lily, of the medical bills piling up on their small kitchen table. She couldn't risk this job. She had to stay invisible. The aide emerged from the room again, his face set like stone. "Mr. Crowley, our time is up. Mr. Volkov has decided to postpone. He sends his regrets." He turned, preparing to gather his boss. The words were a death knell. Crowley looked like he had been physically struck. His face went ashen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. All his ambition, all his carefully constructed authority was crumbling around him. And in that moment of utter professional ruin, his eyes swept the room and landed on Jasmine. He needed a target, a receptacle for his failure and rage, and she was the perfect choice. He strode toward her, his movements jerky and aggressive. Jasmine instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to the locket at her throat, a small silver oval that held a faded picture of her parents. "You!" Crowley spat, his voice low and venomous, yet loud enough for the nearby tables to turn their heads. "What are you staring at? Do you find this amusing?" "No, Mr. Crowley, of course not. I was just—" "You were just— what? Eavesdropping?" he sneered, stepping into her personal space. The scent of his expensive, cloying cologne was suffocating. "Enjoying the show? Hoping to see me fail?" Jasmine was stunned into silence. The accusation was so baseless, so cruel, that she couldn't form a response. The quiet murmurs of the dining room began to die down as patrons sensed the unfolding drama. This was no longer a discreet managerial correction. It was becoming a public spectacle. I wasn't, sir. I was concerned." "Concerned?" He let out a short, ugly laugh. "A waitress is concerned about a $500 million deal. That's rich. Let me tell you what you should be concerned with. You should be concerned with the smudge on that wine glass at table 9. You should be concerned with the fact that Mrs. Vanderbilt has been waiting 3 minutes for her decaf cappuccino. That is your world. That is the extent of your importance here." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to wound and diminish. Jasmine felt her cheeks flush with a hot, shameful blush. She could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on her, the wealthy patrons watching with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, her fellow staff members staring at their shoes, terrified of being drawn into Crowley's vortex of fury. From the corner of her eye, she saw Nikolai Volkov and his aide pause at the entrance to the private dining room. They couldn't understand the words, but the universal language of a bully was unmistakable. Volkov's expression, previously one of cold irritation, was now one of deep, undisguised contempt. He was watching this display, and it was confirming every negative assumption he had about the establishment. "You know, this is your fault," Crowley suddenly declared, his voice rising in pitch, becoming wild and unhinged. He was no longer just talking to her. He was performing for the audience, for the ghost of the deal he had just lost. "This whole disaster, it's the attitude, the entitlement. People like you," he said, the phrase dripping with venom. "You come into a place like this, and you think you're part of it. You overhear a few things, and suddenly you think you have opinions, you think you matter." The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was a phrase she had heard before, a coded dismissal of her class, her status, her very being. "Your job is to be silent. Your job is to be invisible," he was practically shouting now, jabbing a finger toward her face. "But you can't even do that, right? You're standing here with your big, concerned eyes, distracting everyone from the real business being done by people who actually have the education and the breeding to understand it. You probably can't even balance your own checkbook, and you're concerned about a multinational negotiation." He was losing control, his professional mask shattered, revealing the ugly, insecure man beneath. He was a drowning man, and he was determined to pull her under with him. "Let me give you a piece of free advice," he snarled, leaning in so close she could see the tiny broken blood vessels around his nose. "In the real world, little girls who pour coffee for a living don't get a seat at the table. They don't have solutions. They are the problem. You are a distraction, an irrelevance. And now you're fired. Get your things and get out of my restaurant." The final words, "Get out of my restaurant," echoed in the sudden, profound silence. The humiliation was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. For a moment, she wanted to dissolve, to simply cease to exist. But then, something else rose up through the shame. It was a cold, hard fury. It was the memory of her grandmother's voice, telling her stories of defiance in the face of tyranny. It was the image of her professor at Georgetown, praising her analytical mind. It was the thought of Lily, who faced every day with a courage that dwarfed the petty cruelties of a man like Martin Crowley. She looked past Crowley's contorted face to Nikolai Volkov, who was watching her with an intense, unreadable expression. He was about to walk out that door, not just because of a missing translator, but because of the ugliness he had just witnessed. He was about to leave, believing this restaurant, and perhaps the entire partnership, was rotten at its core. And in that instant, Jasmine Olivia made a choice. She had spent 18 months making herself invisible. Now, she would make herself heard. She lifted her chin, and for the first time, she met Martin Crowley's furious gaze directly. Her own eyes were clear and steady. The trembling in her hand stopped. The burning in her chest transformed from shame into strength. "You're wrong, Mr. Crowley," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the grand dining room with the clarity of a ringing bell. Every head turned. Even Crowley was so stunned by her defiance that he was momentarily speechless. "You're wrong about everything," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. She then shifted her gaze, looking directly at the Russian billionaire who stood by the door. She took a breath, letting the familiar, beautiful sounds of her grandmother's native tongue fill the space between them. "Господин Volkov," she began, her Russian accent flawless, imbued with the formal respect the language demanded. «Прошу прощения за эту недостойную сцену. Ваш помощник прав. Это проявление некомпетентности. Но это некомпетентность одного человека, а не всей организации. Mr. Volkov, I ask your forgiveness for this unworthy scene. Your aid is correct. This is a display of incompetence, but it is the incompetence of one man, not the entire organization." The effect was like a lightning strike in the center of the room. A collective gasp rippled through the patrons. Carlos, standing by the kitchen door, dropped a stack of napkins. Martin Crowley's jaw fell open, his face a comical mask of disbelief and horror. Nikolai Volkov's wintry eyes widened, first in shock, then in a flicker of profound, intellectual curiosity. He took a step forward, away from the door, his full attention now locked on the young waitress in the simple black dress. He ignored the sputtering manager completely and responded to her in his own language, his tone sharp and testing. «Вы говорите по-русски? You speak Russian? Откуда? Ваш акцент. Он чистый, но я не могу определить регион. Where from? Your accent. It is clean, but I cannot place the region». Jasmine's mind, honed by years of academic rigor, snapped into focus. This was not a social nicety. It was an examination. He was testing her authenticity, her depth of knowledge. «Моя бабушка была из Ленинграда», she replied smoothly. «Она научила меня языку и истории, которые не найти в учебниках. Я изучала международные отношения в Джорджтаунском университете, специализируясь на постсоветской политике, прежде чем семейные обстоятельства заставили меня уйти. My grandmother was from Leningrad. She taught me the language and the history that you cannot find in textbooks. I studied international relations at Georgetown University, with a focus on post-Soviet policy, before family circumstances forced me to leave. She had just laid bare her entire story, her heritage, her education, her tragedy, in 2 concise sentences. Every word was chosen to convey not just linguistic skill, but competence and context. A slow smile spread across Nikolai Volkov's face. It was not a warm smile, but it was one of genuine intellectual appreciation. It was the smile of a grandmaster recognizing a worthy opponent on the chessboard. He gestured back toward the private dining room. The legal charter for my late wife's foundation is complex. It involves navigating the labyrinth of both American philanthropic law and international intellectual property agreements for the resulting research. The previous translator, I was assured, had a legal background. What would you know of such things? This was the final test. He wasn't asking for a translation, he was asking for an analysis. Jasmine didn't hesitate. The primary challenge will be establishing a framework that protects the Foundation's intellectual property under the YPO treaties, while remaining compliant with IRS Section 50Y1C3 for non-profits. Given your intention for global research collaboration, you'll need specific clauses addressing data sovereignty, particularly with EU partners under GDPR, and a robust arbitration agreement, likely under the Swiss rules, to avoid the US court system in case of international disputes. The detailed expert response, delivered calmly and confidently, hung in the air, shimmering with intelligence. The American legal team, who had been standing awkwardly by the door, stared at her with open astonishment. One of them whispered to his colleague, "She's not just right, she's brilliant. She just summarized 3 months of our preliminary work in 30 seconds." Nikolai Volkov was no longer smiling. He was looking at her with an expression of profound respect. He turned his head and addressed the utterly broken Martin Crowley, switching to heavily accented but perfectly clear English for the first time. "This waitress," he said, the word now sounding like the highest of compliments, "has shown more intelligence, competence, and dignity in the last 2 minutes than you have in the last hour. You told her she was irrelevant. It appears you are the one who is irrelevant." He then looked back at Jasmine. "Miss Olivia," she supplied, her voice quiet but firm. "Jasmine Olivia." "Miss Olivia," Volkov said, his tone now one of a colleague addressing an equal. "The position of translator is clearly beneath your capabilities. However, for today, I would be honored if you would assist us, after which you and I will discuss a more permanent and suitable position within my foundation. We have need of a mind like yours." He then turned to the assembled lawyers and his aide. "The meeting is back on. Miss Olivia will be joining us." Without a backward glance at the manager who had just fired her, Jasmine walked toward the private dining room. The hushed restaurant erupted in a low murmur, which quickly swelled into a wave of spontaneous, scattered applause from the patrons who had witnessed the entire exchange. It was a sound Jasmine had never heard before, a sound of vindication that washed over her, cleansing the stain of the public humiliation. As she passed Martin Crowley, she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. He stood frozen in the center of the room, a statue of his own obsolescence, his face the color of ash. He had tried to extinguish her light, and instead he had only provided the darkness needed for it to blaze for the entire world to see. In his attempt to prove she was nothing, he had inadvertently revealed that she was everything he could never be. The heavy door of the St. Regis room closed, shutting out the world of clinking glasses and hushed whispers, and enclosing Jasmine in the silent, high-stakes universe she had been born to inhabit. The long, polished table reflected the faces of 5 powerful men: Nikolai Volkov, his aide, and 3 senior partners from one of New York's most prestigious law firms. They were all looking at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, awe, and expectation. Just an hour ago, her primary concern had been the temperature of their soup. Now, the success of a $500 million philanthropic endeavor rested on her shoulders. For a fleeting moment, panic fluttered in her chest. The uniform she wore felt like a costume, a fraud. But then she met Volkov's gaze. His eyes were not just testing her anymore. They were encouraging. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that said, "You belong here." Jasmine took a deep breath and drew on the discipline that had been drilled into her at Georgetown and the quiet strength inherited from her grandmother. She took the seat offered to her, not at the edge of the room, but at the table itself, directly across from Volkov. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and professional, "Mr. Volkov has outlined his primary dahuawaxi." The heavy door of the St. Regis room clicked shut, the sound a definitive seal separating 2 worlds. Outside was the life she had known for 18 agonizing months, a world of deference, invisibility, and the clatter of other people's lives. Inside was a silent, rarefied atmosphere, thick with the scent of old leather, lemon polish, and the immense gravitational pressure of capital. 5 men, titans of law and industry, turned their gazes upon her. It was the most intense scrutiny she had ever faced, a stark contrast to the vacant stares that had slid past her for so long. For a dizzying, terrifying second, she felt the starched fabric of her uniform constricting her throat. The ghost of the waitress, the girl who worried about water spots and smudged glasses, clawed at the edges of her composure. Then she met Nikolai Volkov's eyes across the polished mahogany expanse. They were not the eyes of a savior or a benefactor. They were the eyes of a master strategist who had just discovered an unexpected, powerful piece on the chessboard. There was no pity in them, only a cold, clear-eyed expectation. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that was not of encouragement, but of command. "Perform," it said. "Validate my judgment." That silent command was the anchor she needed. The panic receded, replaced by a crystalline focus she hadn't felt since her last debate at Georgetown. She was no longer a waitress in a borrowed reality. She was an analyst in her native element. She took the seat they offered her, not at the periphery, but at the table itself, a silent acknowledgement of her new role. The leather was cool and firm against her back. She placed her hands on the table, a conscious effort to stop their trembling, and drew a deep, steadying breath. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice resonating with a calm authority that surprised even herself. "Mr. Volkov has outlined his primary concerns regarding the Charter. Shall we begin with Article 7, the intellectual property clauses?" What unfolded over the next 3 hours was not a translation. It was a symphony of strategic communication. Jasmine became a living bridge, not just between 2 languages, but between 2 vastly different worlds of thought. The American legal team, led by a sharp, pragmatic partner named Peterson, spoke in the precise, transactional language of Western contract law. "Article 7A, Peterson stated, pointing a manicured finger at the document. "All inventions, discoveries, and patents resulting from Foundation-funded research are the sole and exclusive property of the Elena Volkov Foundation, in perpetuity, throughout the universe." It's standard boilerplate. Jasmine listened, her mind processing not just the words, but the underlying assumptions. She turned to Volkov, the cadence of her Russian fluid and respectful. "Nikolai Ilyich," she began, using the formal patronymic, a subtle sign of cultural understanding. The legal team proposes a standard American work-for-hire framework. It grants the foundation absolute and exclusive ownership of all resulting patents. While legally sound in the United States, it is uncompromising. Volkov's brow furrowed slightly. Uncompromising how? The foundation pays for the work. The foundation owns the results. It is logical. It is logical, Jasmine conceded, but it may not be wise. In the Russian and European academic spheres, there is a deep-seated tradition of authors' rights, a recognition of the creator's moral and intellectual legacy, separate from commercial ownership. Top researchers from the Skolkovo Institute or the Max Planck Society might see this clause not as a business term, but as an erasure of their life's work. They would see it as a gilded cage. She watched his expression shift, the gears of his formidable intellect turning. He wasn't just hearing a translation, he was receiving a crucial piece of strategic intelligence. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that this clause, while intended to protect our assets, could instead repel the very talent we need to create them." "Precisely," Jasmine affirmed. "It prioritizes control over collaboration. I would propose an alternative. We can draft language that grants the foundation irrevocable, exclusive commercial rights worldwide, but carves out a provision for perpetual academic attribution to the lead scientists and their teams. We could even structure a tiered royalty system, a small percentage of net profits from commercialized patents that flows back to the researcher's home institution. It would transform a potential point of conflict into a powerful recruitment tool." A slow, appreciative gleam entered Volkov's eyes. "Honor and profit, an elegant synthesis. Explain this to them. Use their language. Make them understand it is not a concession, but a strategic advantage." Jasmine turned back to the American lawyers. "Mr. Volkov agrees with the core principle of protecting the Foundation's assets. However, he is concerned that the current language, rooted in American corporate law, may be culturally dissonant with the international academic talent he wishes to attract. He proposes a hybrid model. The Foundation retains exclusive and perpetual commercial rights, but the Charter will formally guarantee academic attribution and institute a profit-sharing mechanism with the originating research teams. He believes this will make the Foundation a more attractive partner globally, ensuring we recruit the best minds, not just the most available ones." Peterson, the lead lawyer, leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his legal pad. He looked at Jasmine, then at his junior partners, a flicker of genuine astonishment on his face. "For 3 weeks, we've been wargaming how to structure incentives for international recruitment. We discussed signing bonuses, endowment chairs, lab funding, and we missed the simplest, most powerful incentive of all: respect. It's brilliant. It protects our clients' interests while appealing to the ego and legacy of the academics. Draft a memo on a hybrid IP royalty model, Section 7B. Let's get it done." And so it went. For hours, Jasmine was the nexus of the entire negotiation. She smoothed over cultural friction points, rephrased confrontational demands as collaborative proposals, and identified potential ambiguities before they could fester into future lawsuits. She was no longer thinking in English or Russian. She was thinking in the universal language of motivation, fear, and ambition. The waitress uniform she wore became an absurdity, a shed skin from a former life. She was a diplomat. She was a strategist. She was precisely the person her grandmother had raised her to be, the person Georgetown had been shaping. During a brief recess, while a terrified young waiter brought in coffee and pastries, pointedly avoiding eye contact with Jasmine as if she had undergone some divine transformation, Volkov gestured for her to remain as the others left the room. He stood by the large window, looking down at the river of yellow cabs on the street below. "Your grandmother," he said in Russian, his voice quieter now, stripped of its boardroom severity. "From Leningrad. Did she survive the siege?" "Yes," Jasmine said, the memory a familiar, sacred ache. "She was a child. She told me stories of eating wallpaper paste and leather belts. She said that after surviving a winter like that, the cruelty of men in suits was just noise." A shadow passed over Volkov's face, a deep, ancient grief. "My Elena, my wife, she was not a fighter. She was a scholar, a biologist. She faced her illness with a scientist's curiosity, taking notes on her own body's betrayal until the very end." He turned from the window, his eyes locking onto hers. "This foundation, it is the final chapter of her research, her last set of notes. It must be perfect. It must be a reflection of her spirit, rigorous, brilliant, and profoundly humane. When you spoke of respect, of legacy, you were not just translating words. You were translating her soul. I heard her voice in your explanation. The confession was so raw, so intensely personal, it left Jasmine breathless. This wasn't a transaction for him. It was a resurrection. It was a desperate, magnificent attempt to build a monument of meaning out of the rubble of a senseless loss. In his grief, she saw the reflection of her own, the hollow space left by her parents, the fierce, protective love that now fueled her every action for Lily. They were two solitary lighthouses, built on foundations of loss, signaling to each other across a vast, dark ocean. "I understand, Nikolai Ilyich," she whispered, the words imbued with an empathy that was absolute. "I understand completely." When the meeting finally concluded, the charter was not just signed, it was transformed. It was a stronger, more intelligent, and more resilient document. Peterson shook her hand, his grip firm with genuine admiration. "Miss Olivia, in 30 years of international law, I have never seen anything like that. You are a natural. My firm has a standing need for consultants with your skill set. The position would come with a significant salary and a clear path to partnership. Name your price." Before Jasmine could even process the staggering offer, Volkov stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand lightly on her shoulder. "A generous offer, Mr. Peterson, but Miss Olivia's talents are already spoken for. She has agreed to join the Elena Volkov Foundation as the Director of International Academic Relations." He then looked directly at Jasmine, a faint smile playing on his lips. Her first official duty will be to re-enroll at Georgetown to complete her degree. The foundation will, of course, cover all tuition and living expenses. We cannot have our director lacking the proper credentials after all. The world tilted. The air in her lungs seemed to vanish, replaced by a dizzying surge of pure, unadulterated hope. It wasn't just a job. It was the restoration of a stolen future. It was the path back to herself. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed since the phone call that had shattered her life. "Mr. Volkov, I don't know what to say." "There is nothing to say now," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "My office will contact you tomorrow with a formal contract. For the present..." He retrieved a slim platinum checkbook and a pen from his breast pocket. He wrote with swift, decisive strokes, tore out the check, and slid it across the table toward her. "An advance on your salary, and a signing bonus to address any lingering distractions." Jasmine picked it up. Her fingers, so steady during the complex negotiation, now trembled. The number written on the line was obscene, fantastical. It had 6 zeros after the initial digit. It was more than security. It was liberation. It was the cost of Lily's specialized medications for a decade. It was the price of a full night's sleep, free from the terror of impending bills. It was the sound of her sister breathing easy. Just as they were preparing to depart, the door swung open. A portly, silver-haired man in a bespoke suit hurried in, his face a mask of profound apology. Behind him, looking shrunken and grey, stood Martin Crowley. "Mr. Volkov, Miss Olivia," the owner, Mr. Davenport, began, his voice booming with practiced sincerity. "I have just been made aware of the grotesque incident that occurred in my dining room. I cannot begin to express my apologies. The behavior of my general manager was an abhorrent anomaly, a violation of every principle the Marlowe estate stands for." He fixed Crowley with a look of cold fury. "Martin, you are suspended, pending termination. Hand your keys to security. You will be escorted from the premises." Crowley, a man whose entire identity was woven from the authority of his position, seemed to implode. He didn't argue. He didn't speak. He simply fumbled with a key ring, his hands shaking, and passed it to the silent security guard who had materialized at his side. As he was led away, his vacant eyes swept past Jasmine without a flicker of recognition. It was as if she had already ascended to a plane of existence he could no longer perceive. His professional life was over, demolished not by a corporate rival, but by the quiet waitress he had deemed an irrelevance. Davenport turned back to Jasmine, his expression shifting to one of magnanimous opportunity. "Miss Olivia, your position here is, of course, entirely secure. In fact, in light of recent events and your obvious, hidden talents, we would be honored to offer you the position of general manager, effective immediately. The salary will be more than commensurate." A month ago, even a week ago, that offer would have been a miracle. She would have accepted with tears of gratitude. But standing there, in the aftermath of the battle she had just won, she saw the offer for what it was: a promotion to a more luxurious cage. Her world was no longer defined by these four walls. A real smile, the first of the day, bloomed on her face. It was confident and serene. "That is an incredibly generous offer, Mr. Davenport. Thank you. But I must decline. I have just accepted another position." Walking out of the Marlowe estate was a physical rebirth. The late afternoon sun struck her face, and for the first time in months, it felt like a blessing, not just a marker of another exhausting day. The cacophony of the city, the sirens, the horns, the chorus of 1,000 conversations, sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. She clutched her purse, the crisp rectangle of the check inside a tangible anchor to her new reality. Her first stop was not home. She directed the cab to the 24-hour pharmacy, the one that always had Lily's most complex medications in stock. She walked past the aisles of mundane remedies and stood before the pharmacist's counter. She smoothed out the wrinkled list of prescriptions, the list that was a source of weekly triage and heartache. "I'd like to fill all of these, please," she said, her voice clear and steady. The pharmacist, a tired-looking woman who recognized her, began the familiar, sorrowful calculus. "All right, let's see which ones your insurance will partially cover this week." "No," Jasmine interrupted gently. "All of them. And I'll be paying out of pocket for a 6-month supply." The woman looked up, her expression shifting from pity to bewilderment. Jasmine simply smiled and slid the check through the opening in the glass. The pharmacist's eyes widened as she read it. She looked at Jasmine, then back at the check, then back at Jasmine again, as if trying to reconcile the young woman in the simple black uniform with the impossible number written in ink. Without another word, she turned and began to fill the order. When Jasmine finally walked through the door of their small, worn apartment, The heavy bags from the pharmacy rustling in her arms, Lily was curled on the sofa, a textbook resting on her lap. The sound of her sister's breathing was a shallow, familiar rhythm that had dictated the tempo of Jasmine's life. "You're late," Lily said, her voice thin but laced with her usual wry humor. "Did Crowley make you polish the silver with your tears again?" Jasmine set the bags down on the floor with a heavy, satisfying thud, the sound of a future secured. She sank onto the couch beside her sister, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She took Lily's cool, delicate hand in her own. "Lily," she started, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "Something happened today, something that changes everything." And she told her. She recounted the entire epic in miniature, the arrival of the Russian Titan, the translator's burst appendix, Crowley's venomous public tirade, and the moment she had chosen to speak. She described the shock on their faces, the shift in the room's gravity, the high-stakes negotiation, and the final, stunning reversal of fortune. As she spoke, she watched the emotions flicker across Lily's pale face. Disbelief, then outrage on her behalf, and finally, a slow, dawning, radiant wonder. "You really did it?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide as saucers. "You spoke Russian, right in front of all those rich people? Like Baba used to when she was mad at the landlord?" "Just like Baba," Jasmine confirmed, a laugh bubbling up through her tears. "And Georgetown, you're really going back?" "I am." Lily's gaze dropped to the bags on the floor. "And the medicine?" The question was a fragile breath, freighted with years of fear. Jasmine reached into her purse, her hand closing around the folded deposit slip from the bank. She unfolded it and placed it in her sister's lap. Lily stared at the number, her finger tracing the printed digits as if they were a foreign language. When she looked up, her face was a mess of tears, and the most beautiful, broken smile Jasmine had ever seen. "Does this mean—" she choked out, the words catching in her throat. "Does this mean I can be on the new trial? The one Dr. Evans said was our best hope, but that insurance wouldn't cover?" The question struck Jasmine with the force of a physical blow. In her own whirlwind of restored ambition and newfound security, she hadn't even dared to hope that far. But of course, that's what this meant. Not just maintenance, but a chance at a cure. A real future. She pulled her sister into a fierce, desperate hug, burying her face in Lily's soft hair, inhaling the scent of home and love and everything that mattered. "Yes," she whispered, her voice raw. "Yes, Lily. You can be on the trial, you can do anything. From now on, your only job is to fight, to get strong. My job is to take care of absolutely everything else." Holding her sister, Jasmine looked around the small apartment that had been her sanctuary and her cage. The faded floral wallpaper, the worn-out armchair, the stack of medical bills on the coffee table. They were relics of a life that had just ended. She had been forged in the crucible of this room, her intellect sharpened by desperation, her spirit tempered by sacrifice. The world had tried to make her invisible, to define her by an apron and a name tag. But it had failed. It had mistaken her silence for submission, her service for simplicity. It had never imagined that within the quiet waitress was a dormant queen, waiting not for a prince, but for a reason to pick up her own sword and claim her own kingdom. And today, she had.